Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from the future sound of London, Environment 7.003. Well, I almost didn't think we were going to get to this point, but here we finally are, the conclusion to FSOL's Environment 7 trilogy. I was both really excited for this moment and yet also slightly deflated by it at the same time. I don't feel like I need to introduce who FSOL are. I've covered them a number of times, including dedicated videos on both of the previous albums in this trilogy, which you can find linked in the description. If you want a small recap, when these guys came out with their Rituals E7.001 album in April of last year, it was really exciting to see them coming back with their first new proper studio album since 2016, one that even got the regular fans excited, what with it having a title that didn't have the word environment in it. Even though, it is also a part of that series. And all the other albums in that series, especially from its fourth volume onwards, are where the band's been putting all their highest effort new material this whole time, right under several fans' noses. But for the fans who didn't know that the Environment series had gotten to a point where new installments could actually be comparable in quality to the classics the bands were putting out in the 90s, this was a new album that could finally get their attention. Rituals admittedly wasn't anything new the band hadn't explored in previous installments of the series, mostly a mix of their usual liquid ambience with a few colder IDM textures, but it was very well constructed, flowed really well with lots of stellar standouts, it lived up to the high standard that this band should deliver, and I came back to it enough where it ended up just barely notching an honorable mention on my year-end list for 2022. But it was obviously also announced as only the first part of a trilogy, which left me even more intrigued as to what might be coming later down the road. Especially since the band's previous albums before Rituals came out were the duology of Environment 6 and 6.5 in 2016, which had turned out to be two very different projects that also complemented each other well, and when put together, felt like a celebration of everything that Gaz Cobain and Brian Dugans had ever done together through their entire decades-long history. So I had been hoping that if this was only the beginning, that later installments in the trilogy would be exploring new territory that Rituals didn't cover. They didn't announce any kind of time frame of when those sequels would be coming out though, so it left most of us fans patiently sitting around and perhaps getting tense as to what might be coming down the pipeline. And eventually, in October of last year, they released the second installment in the series, A Space of Partial Illumination, to finally reveal to us just how they were going to be building on the sounds of Rituals. Apparently, by just putting out more stuff that sounded like that album. A Space of Partial Illumination was a good album, but outside of a few absolutely astounding high points, most notably the track All This Has Happened Before, it just kind of felt like a repeat of the previous album that didn't flow nearly as well or come together as a whole as effectively. Where Rituals felt like it was coming together more as a single overarching experience with all the tracks adding together to the same environment, I felt like the 16 tracks on Partial Illumination felt a fair bit more disconnected from each other. Ideas would just kind of show up without really reinforcing any other ideas surrounding them. Not to mention, where Rituals felt like it had the ability to stand on its own as an album completely removed from the context of being part of a trilogy or any other greater series, Partial Illumination felt like it needed Rituals and perhaps a third album later down the line to reinforce it and make it feel more complete. It had a weird, non-indicative start and a kinda anticlimax ending that felt like they were leading in and out of something greater, which in itself would be putting more pressure on that third volume to finally pay everything off. Once again, it took a really long time for this third volume to finally be announced, even significantly longer, but eventually it came out just over a full year after Partial Illumination, and it felt like the announcement and release of it really came and went super quickly with very little fanfare. It left me honestly kind of worried about what we were about to get here. For one thing, there was the album title and cover. No special subtitle on this one, it is just the thing they announced it to be. And not really even having a cover either, it's just plain text on a white background. Now, to be fair, I suspect for a lot of fans that in itself could be exciting, because that lack of a cover is a clear direct reference to their 1995 album ISDN, and that one is a huge fan favorite. For me personally, this was less exciting since ISDN is my personal easy least favorite out of those first four classic albums they put out in the 90s. Which, before you come at me with the pitchforks and torches and all that, is not saying much. I do still think ISDN is a very solid album that exemplifies all the things that made the band stick out from the crowd back in the day, and I do understand where all its biggest fans come from. I just happen to think that Accelerator, Lifeforms, and Dead Cities are on a whole different level above it. I feel like the latter of those three in particular significantly improved upon a lot of the ideas that ISDN introduced, and took them to a much further extreme that stands apart as something much more unique in their catalog. In any case, the unassuming presentation and rather abrupt release of E7.03 here wasn't the biggest of confidence boosters for me, at least on a personal level. Nor was the single track being revealed as a promotional teaser, the album's closer, One Solar Radius. I mean, it was cool, a nice and pleasant little cut, but purely as a standalone track, it left little to no impact on me, and that was significantly more worrying since it's the damn closer to send off this entire trilogy as a whole, one that started out on such a soaring high note with a track like Hopiate, but seeming to finish on like a bit of a nothing anticlimax? Was it possible that all the wait for this trilogy to complete may have left all this potential on the table, never to be fulfilled? Have the band run out of ideas and written themselves into a corner, promising more than they were actually prepared to deliver? Still, despite all the bad feelings I had going into this album, I still had to hear it to see how it would actually stack up. And, I mean, as it turns out, I may have just been getting myself worried over nothing, since this album turned out to be just as solid as always. It's basically exactly the ending I expected this series would get after I heard A Space of Partial Illumination. More of the same stuff that very much exists within the same universe as the other projects in this trilogy, but also feels more like an actual ending. Also, thankfully, like Rituals, we're back to a project that cohesively flows together and can effectively work as its own standalone project. I do feel like that album does have more substance to it, where this one feels smaller scale, but they're definitely not making a half-hearted effort with this project either. Honestly, right from when the opener Future Testaments came on, within 20 seconds, all my fears for this album went out the window immediately. This opener goes hard as fuck. All the crashing, live drumming going up next to all these funky electric bass lines slamming you in the face, directly reminding me of my favorite track from ISDN, The Far Out Son of Lung and the Ramblings of a Madman. Not even getting to all the jazzy trumpet licks and cool organic percussion and electronic effects and new synth bass patterns thrown in for extra texture. Good reminder that, oh right, these guys are freaking great at what they do, and I own all their albums on CD, including the Amorphous Androgynous ones, as well as this t-shirt I'm currently wearing for good reason. I mean, between this and the opener to Spunkshine's most recent album, fans of big heavy breakbeats with live bass are eating well this year. That opener is admittedly my favorite track on the album, and none of the other tracks are quite as hard-hitting, but they do continue to deliver lots of cool ideas going from there. It's immediately followed by a really nice, tender and emotional ambient sort of interlude and resting point. The way all the guitar and synth pads and wordless humming vocals go up next to the delicate field recordings of Rain and Seagulls comes together really nicely. And I don't know why, but I feel like I'm getting some mild, like, David Byrne solo vibes out of this arrangement. I feel like I may have heard something like that out of him before. Next up, we got A Desolate Stretch of Night Road, which definitely evokes the vibe its title seems to describe. A lot of slapping, mildly hip-hop flavored beat work going up next to a lot of peaceful and airy but somewhat chilling synth pads that get bigger and more expansive as the track goes on. Also, there's some samples of those glittering triangle sounds that they used on old classic tracks. There's like Cascade in a few spots. Very nice. Then that leads into Where All Is Ending, where we get more of our spacious ambient fix, floating through lots of various light and airy pads, whooshing sound effects, and 90s synth choirs, with a few little Asian flute riffs for good measure. I'll admit this also marks a point at which my attention briefly trails off pretty consistently. A track like this is all very abstract and formless and doesn't have a lot of specifically defined identity to set itself apart from the crowd, but it is one that's grown on me the more frequently I've listened to it. And it bleeds directly into Overwrite, a track that honestly I barely even notice at all on most listens, but can deliver some more liquid ideas with a lot of sloshing water sound effects, light tapping and squelching percussion patterns, and more airy ambience that kinda matches the previous track. It's cool, has a bit more of its own identity as I actually sit up and listen to it up close, but it can definitely fall in the background. And it's definitely not as cool as the following track, I'm Eating Here, which always totally sticks out to me in the best way the second it comes up in the track listing. Most characterized by all these warm, slightly 80s-ish guitar melodies going up next to this laid-back live drumming with some delicate but deep and grooving bass lines to complement it. that all adds up to an interestingly much more jazzy sound that I wasn't expecting to hear out of this album. Absolutely one of the more unique ideas I've heard out of this entire trilogy. From there, we get a minute-long interlude of melancholic guitar wailing drones and echoes of inherent sense, which is just kind of there, whatever. And then we move into Space of Sequent Familiar, another consistent favorite moment of mine, characterized by lots of very light but decently propulsive shuffling percussive loops going up next to loads of cinematic synth pads and filtered waves of bass layering over each other that add up to a very triumphant and happy and major key vibe that sets itself apart from the rest of the album's sound, but adds to all the vibes it's already been setting up so far at the same time. And that leads into an even bigger highlight with Drift Incline, itself starting out with all these tiny little synth blips plinking away over a slightly darker take on the typically organic atmosphere established with something like the previous track, but eventually kicking into high gear and introducing these heavier breakbeats that take the track to a new level and give it a much more exciting, propulsive groove. Though from there we get a handful of tracks that tended to fall into the background more for me. Trichome has an interesting enough mix of very subtle and muted pads going up next to much slower and quieter tapping percussion patterns and a couple of off-kilter woodwind textures. Definitely adds up to some nice enough hypnotic effect and makes for a solid, more desolate and experimental moment for the album, though not one that would always stick out to me. And Absence of Solution delivers a similarly desolate and experimental mix with some slightly faster beat work that definitely sounds like it's pulled out of some moments from the Lifeforms days. Though this stood out to me even less in context, there's not much this track delivers that even an earlier one in the track listing of this album, such as Overwrite, could deliver as well. It's just kind of there, and it's another moment that I would almost never notice whenever it came up. Thankfully, the album does slowly pick back up for its final stretch. The heavier banging break beats come back for following track Kwaahu, which has a much darker approach to its sound than maybe any other track here. The squirting bass line and dissonant pads swirling all around this one feels particularly foreboding and creepy. But there's also a few synth oboes and pianos and psychedelic guitar solos introduced in the second half to give the mix more body and texture. But things get even better from there as we transition seamlessly into Ruler, which takes a lot of similar sounds carried over from the previous track and reconstructs them over this other shuffling and off-kilter jazz-flavored beat that ends up feeling like a direct raising of stakes and energy, while maintaining that slightly more menacing feeling. And if it's off-kilter and experimental you want, next up we have quite possibly the most off-kilter and experimental moment the album has to offer yet, fittingly titled Awkward Shape, switching off between delivering all this menacing but also strangely hollow near-atonal bass, going up next to beatwork that ricochets between being low energy and lumbering or skittering and fast-paced while still stuffing in more occasional Asian flute riffs and more organic percussion textures in the background. Very strange track, but the strangeness is welcome. And finally, we reach the album's above-mentioned closer, One Solar Radius. Now, I may have already mentioned that I thought this track was pretty weak as a standalone single, and I do kind of stand by that. I still feel like this probably wasn't the best track to actively sell people on the album as a whole. Giving people one or two more other teasers like with the other albums would probably help. But after hearing this track in the greater context of this album, I did warm up to it quite a bit. It may not be as much of a soaring height as the way the trilogy started in Hopiate, but its looping major key guitar melodies and occasional more expansive pads going up next to its skittering beatwork, that occasionally even has a mild trap flavor to it at one point, do create a really subtle but sunny and positive feeling that, especially after that entire run of darker and more foreboding tracks leading up to it, really furthers the feeling of like seeing a light at the end of the tunnel and coming out of the other end feeling refreshed and hopeful. And the guitar melodies do sort of resemble some of those sitar melodies on Hopiate, so it can somewhat effectively bring the trilogy full circle in a nice way anyway. If I have any major problem with the track now, is that the very end of it cuts off really abruptly. Like, one last note echoing out at the very end would have provided more of a satisfying note of finality for this entire little series, but out of the three album closers of these E7 albums, it is easily the strongest and the one that most feels like an actual closer rather than a weird, arbitrary, to-be-continued kind of moment. And that's everything on Environment 7.003. A lot of good stuff here for sure. It's another solid effort from the band that exemplifies all their usual strengths, makes for a fitting send-off to this whole E7 trilogy. Do I think it's a great album, though? No. At best, it's about on par with The Space of Partial Illumination, and it might be ever so slightly weaker. This album does feel much better defined as a complete unbroken whole than that album did, with a far better sense of flow. Where the last two albums could often have a marginally colder and more wintry feel to them, this album feels like we're moving into spring, like all the ice is melting and nature is coming back to life. Which is a weird feeling to get off an album released at the end of October, but still cool. On the other hand, I do also feel like this album had more moments that just fell in the background without leaving a strong impression on me than the other two albums. Partial Illumination may have been a much messier listen, but it felt like there was more going on there than there was here. There are a bunch of tracks here which strike me as a bit too empty and barren. And at the end of the entire trilogy, as much as I have enjoyed the ride, I can't help but think this miniseries could have been so much more than it actually turned out to be. All three albums can have the feeling of FSOL just kind of generically doing their usual thing without putting enough of a unique twist on it to set itself apart from any number of other projects they've made. I still have to stand behind Rituals as pretty handily the strongest volume of the trilogy for me, and even with that one, I still feel like Environments 5, 6, and 6.5 are better than that. The whole trilogy was very good, but none of it felt like the absolute best work the band has ever done for me. Even more so with this third volume, which could feel a little spotty. But on the flip side to that argument, you know what other album I have similar issues with to that of a project like this, of feeling like a generally solid if inconsistent mixed bag, with some great standouts and a bunch of stuff that falls in the background and kind of doesn't leave as strong an impression, with maybe some parts that feel a little more barren and empty. That describes my feelings on ISDN as well. This album might even flow slightly better than ISDN, even if that one very obviously has much higher high points. My point is, I can't imagine this album is going to go down poorly with fans. I think this is going to give the people exactly what they want out of this band in this day and age. And as the album cover promises, I definitely would not be surprised if the ISDN superfans in particular really end up loving this one. I feel like both of those albums really do a good job of exploring the more subtle and stripped back side of their sound. I may have personally come out of the E7 trilogy hungering for more than what I ended up getting. I don't think it's their best work. But it's definitely not their worst work either, and even in its weakest moments, it exemplifies all the things that made me such a big fan of the band in the first place. E7.003 may not be a great album by any means, but it is a very solid one that I very much enjoyed myself with anytime I put it on. So for that, fittingly enough, I'm feeling a very strong 7.3 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.